The Covenant of Time. Chapter 1, The Gap in Memory. Yezikin has lived in an incomplete family since he was a child. His mother died of illness when he was 3 years old, and his father, Yeshenglan, was an extremely busy business executive. Yeshenglan is always busy with socializing and work, and has almost no time to take care of Yezikin, which makes Yezikin resentful of his father since he was a child. For as long as he can remember, the only one who has been with him is a gentle nanny. Her name is Suyuer. She took care of him like a mother, making him feel a touch of warmth in the cold home. Although Suyuer took care of him, Yezikin always had an unresolved knot in his heart. His memory of his mother was blurry, and he couldn't even recall his mother's face clearly. Every time he looked through the photographs his mother had left for him, the vague blankness intensified, making him feel extremely painful and lost. Yezikin has never forgiven his father, believing that his father is inescapable of the death of his mother. His mother died when he was young, and his father was indifferent and ruthless. He always thought that the person who loved him the most in the world had left him early, and all that was left was those boring jobs and his father's prevarication over and over again. However, one sunny afternoon, fate began to play a big joke on him. Chapter 2, Through Time. One day, Yezikin was reading in the study as usual. There was an old clock in the corner of the study, which was a gift from his father from overseas, and Yezikin didn't care too much about its existence. That day, the clock suddenly made a strange sound. Yezikin turned his head, and saw that the hour and minute hands of the clock began to rotate irregularly, and with a burst of intense light flashing, his body seemed to be pulled by some force. In the blink of an eye, he was in an unknown place. When he stood still, he was stunned by what he saw. He had come to the plane 20 years ago. All these seemingly incomprehensible phenomena instantly surged up in his heart with an inexplicable panic and excitement. He saw that everything around him did not match his familiar home environment. It seemed to be some strange alley, and he suddenly heard a familiar voice coming. When he looked back, he could barely believe his eyes when he saw him. His father, Yeshenglan, was actually 20 years younger, and was talking and laughing with a young woman. The woman's face was so familiar, Yezikin suddenly woke up as if from a dream. It turned out to be his mother, Lin Suling. It's just that she in front of her is young, lively, and carefree, not at all like the seriously ill and frail mother in his memory. What's going on? Yezikin whispered in disbelief. Chapter 3, The Accident of the Encounter. When Yezikin was stunned, his mother suddenly turned her head and seemed to notice him. Lin Suling's gaze briefly met with him, but she didn't seem to recognize him, then turned her head away and continued to talk and laugh with Yeshenglan. Yezikin took a deep breath and walked towards them. When he approached, Yeshenglan smiled and patted Lin Suling's shoulder. Suling, your smile like this really makes me feel happy. Lin Suling smiled lightly. You are so good at talking, I am really afraid that you will be dependent on me. Yezikin was stunned in place, and his heart turned over for a while. He looked at his parents in front of him, and his feelings were extremely complicated. These two people, who are young, seem to have no burden at all, and everything is still so beautiful. However, Yezikin knew that all this would eventually be swallowed up by fate. His mother would eventually die early due to illness, and his father would become the insurmountable wound in his heart. He couldn't help but quicken his pace, came to his parents, and said, You two, you met so quickly. Lin Suling looked at him in surprise. Who are you? Yeshenglan's brows furrowed slightly, as if he was a little puzzled by this stranger. Yezikin was shocked in his heart, and then adjusted his tone. I just saw the two of you so close, and I couldn't help but want to come and ask. The two looked at each other, their eyes full of doubt, but they didn't ask any more questions. Yeshenglan smiled slightly. We are friends who just met, but your friend seems to be very interesting. Yezikin's heart froze. He couldn't help but think back to his childhood, those neglected days. All this seemed to have not happened yet. He began to realize that he might really have come to the past, to that time that he couldn't touch at all. Chapter 4, The Contradiction of Time. As time passed, Yezikin gradually spent more time with his parents. Not only did he witness the love between his parents, but he also went through many things with them when they were younger. Although he knew that all this would eventually lead to the death of his mother, he couldn't suppress the emotional whirlpool in his heart. He began to communicate more with his mother and father, and gradually, he felt a sense of intimacy that he had never felt before. His mother was not as fragile and helpless as he remembered, but a strong, independent woman. And the father, although he is dedicated to his career, is always full of tenderness in his eyes when facing his mother. During this time, Yezikin gradually understood the love between his parents, and also understood his father's helplessness and predicament at that time. When he saw his young mother holding hands with his father, he began to understand that even if this love was finally torn apart by fate, the love that had been there was still sincere and pure. However, as time passed, Yezikin began to fall into deep contradictions. He didn't want to accept his mother's early death, and he didn't want to see his father even more lonely because of the pain he couldn't bear. He wants to change all that, but he finds that he can't stand up to fate. Chapter 5, A Twist and Turn of Fate. One day, when Yezikin was walking with his parents, a sudden accident changed everything. His mother was injured in a car accident and her condition deteriorated sharply, and Yezikin instantly felt a sense of powerless despair. Even if he is here, in the past, he can't change all that. However, Yeshenglan made the most resolute decision in his life. He gave up all his career and began to take care of his mother with all his might, and even put aside everything that once seemed important for the sake of his mother's illness. And Yezikin, from this moment, truly understood his father's deep love for his mother. In the end, although her mother failed to overcome the illness, she said her wish to Yeshenglan and Yezikin before she died: "I hope you can live happily and don't stop because of me." At that moment, Yezikin understood the ruthlessness of fate, and also understood the choices and sacrifices of his parents. No matter what the future holds, he will embrace his life with a tolerant and grateful heart. Chapter 6, The Hope of Rebirth. When Yezikin woke up again, he found himself back in the real world. Although everything has changed, he will no longer be resentful of the loss of his past. His understanding and tolerance of his father made him no longer hold a grudge against the pain of the past. And the memory of my mother is no longer that untouchable blank, but an existence full of love and hope. Yezikin understands that no matter what his fate is, he must learn to let go and reconcile with the past in order to move towards his own tomorrow. Chapter 7, Flowers Bloom on the Other Side. Yezikin, who returned to reality, looked back at everything in the past again, and he felt that he was no longer the boy with resentment and obsession. The pain and resentment of the past seemed to dissipate with time like smoke clouds in the wind. Looking back at his father Yeshenglan, a strict and omnipresent father, Yezikin finally understood his perseverance and helplessness in the past. His father is still by his side, but he is no longer the image that is always cold and detached, but has become a support he can rely on. The estrangement between the two fathers and sons was finally resolved by understanding and communication. Yeshenglan looked at Yezikin, and her eyes were no longer just cold and hard reproaches and expectations, but more love and pride. "Yezikin, you've grown up." Yeshenglan spoke lightly, with a slight softness in his tone, which Yezikin had never heard for many years. Yezikin nodded, a smile on the corner of his mouth. He knows that the closeness of this moment is the precipitation and release of countless memories. However, although he finally understood his father's love, he still couldn't forget his mother's face. He began to think more often about the moments he spent with his mother when he was younger, and although it was vague, his mother's warm smile always flashed in his memory. He gradually realized that the existence of his mother had long been deeply rooted in his life, whether she was in this world or not. So, Yezikin decided that no matter what the future holds, he wants his mother's spirit to continue in his and his father's lives. He wants this love to be more than just memories, but to continue with practical actions. Chapter 8, A Covenant Buried Deep in the Heart. With the passage of time, Yezikin still lives an ordinary and fulfilling life. He completed his studies and began to work in his father's company, where he gradually gained his recognition and trust. The relationship between the two gradually changed from father and son to friends and partners, and they discussed work together and discussed the philosophy of life together. In the process of working together, Yezikin is no longer the disgruntled teenager, but has become his father's most powerful assistant. At a meeting of the company, Yeshenglan finally spoke: "Yezikin, I know that you have been a little worried about whether I have too much expectation of you, and worried about whether I haven't given you enough care." Yezikin looked at his father and said softly, "I know, Dad, the past is over, I no longer hate you, and I no longer cling to those past misses. Everything you gave me has actually exceeded my expectations." A trace of tenderness flashed in Yeshenglan's eyes. He lowered his head and was silent for a moment, and then said, "I'm glad you think so, but I still have a wish, and maybe only you can understand." Yezikin was slightly stunned for a moment, and asked, "What wish?" A trace of complicated emotion flashed in Yeshenglan's eyes. He paused, and slowly spoke, I hope you can pass on your mother's name. Although she died young, her spirit and love should last forever. After Yezikin heard this, his heart shook. He heard deep nostalgia and regret in his father's tone. The death of his mother is not only a loss for Yezikin alone, but also an eternal pain in Yeshenglin's heart. I promise you. Yezikin's eyes flashed with determination, and his voice was extremely resolute. He knew that this was not only a father's last wish, but also a mother's wish. No matter what, he will be motivated by this responsibility and let his mother's love be his eternal guide. Chapter 9, A New Beginning. As time passed, Yezikin gradually took over the company with the support of his father and gradually built the company into an industry leader. While he was busy with work, he still did not forget his mother's spirit. Whenever he had free time, he would go back to his mother's grave, talk to her, report to her about his life and work, and tell her everything he had done. At a ceremony to mourn his mother, Yezikin suddenly felt a familiar power, as if his mother was still guarding him. He engraved his mother's name into his heart, and reminded himself to never forget his original intention at every important moment. One winter evening, Yezikin and Yeshenglan stood in front of the window of the company building, looking at the city in the distance. The setting sun dyed the sky golden, and the two stood silently, without much speech. Yeshenglan suddenly spoke, Zikin, I know that you are no longer the child who doubts everything, you have become a real man, and you have inherited the responsibilities of me and your mother. Yezikin looked at his father with a smile, Thank you, Dad, without your company, I may not have come to this day. But I know that every step I take now is to live up to your and my mother's expectations. The two fathers and sons reached a spiritual resonance at that moment, although the mother had long since passed away, her love has always continued in their hearts. Chapter 10, Love and Inheritance. As time went by, Yezikin finally found his own rhythm of life. His father was still by his side to guide him, and his mother's image became an eternity in his heart. No matter how life changes, Yezikin always firmly believes that love and inheritance are the most precious things in life. Eventually, Yezikin set up a foundation to support children in need, give them the opportunity to receive a good education, and encourage them to pursue their dreams. He hopes that these children, like him, can feel the power of love and hope no matter what difficulties they have experienced. In that bustling city, the names of Yezikin and his father have long been sung. And his mother's name has become the most beautiful mark in his heart, which will never be forgotten. Epilogue. The meaning of life is not to pursue the regrets of the past, but to learn how to live more fully in the present. Yezikin experienced pain, loss, and confusion, but he finally found the power that could heal the wounds of the past, that is, love, whether it was from his parents or his endless thoughts about his mother. Love has always been an eternal force across time, taking people through every difficult period of time and continuing to move towards the future.